The first time Marin noticed something wrong with the house was a Wednesday, though she would not have been able to tell you which Wednesday, because by then the weeks had begun to lose their edges. She had been back from her mother's for 11 days. She remembered that number specifically because she had been counting, the way you count days after a surgery or a loss, waiting for the threshold where normal is supposed to reassemble itself. 11 days. And on the 11th day, she walked into the kitchen and every cabinet was open, not dramatically, not flung wide as if something had torn through, just open. Every single one, including the one above the refrigerator that she needed a step stool to reach, hanging at the same angle, maybe 30 degrees, like someone had gone through the room with a calm and systematic hand and undone every latch. She stood in the doorway with her coffee still hot and looked at the room, and felt nothing at all, which was the part that bothered her later, not the cabinets. The nothing. She closed them. She drank her coffee. She went to work. Marin was a structural engineer for a mid-size firm in Eugene, Oregon. She worked mostly on retrofits for older commercial buildings, earthquake resilience assessments, the quiet math of making sure things that were already standing would keep standing. She was good at it. She liked the logic, the way a building would tell you what was wrong with it if you knew how to listen to load paths and tension patterns. Her colleagues liked her. Her supervisor trusted her. She had a specific reputation for being unflappable during field assessments, the kind of person who could stand in a basement with a visible crack propagating through a bearing wall and calmly describe the failure mode without raising her voice. She had cultivated this about herself. It had cost her something to build it, and she was aware of the cost, and she had decided it was worth it. Her mother had died on a Saturday in January. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. Marin had driven down to Ashland and spent the last 6 weeks in the house she grew up in, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, managing hospice nurses and medication schedules, and the slow, grueling bureaucracy of watching someone leave. Her mother had been difficult. That is a word that does a lot of work while saying almost nothing. And Marin knew it, but she used it anyway, because the more precise words were ones she had placed in a room inside herself a long time ago and locked. Her mother had been difficult. Marin had managed. She had managed the dying and the funeral and the estate paperwork and the clearing of the house, and then she had driven back to Eugene and returned to her own house and closed the door and stood in the hallway for what might have been 10 minutes, breathing, and then she had unpacked. That was the 11 days ago, and now the cabinets, she mentioned it to no one. There was nothing to mention. She had probably opened them herself in some fugue of morning autopilot and forgotten. She acknowledged, not sleeping well. The dreams were not nightmares exactly. They were reenactments. Her mother's kitchen, her mother's voice, not saying anything cruel, just talking, filling every room with sound until there was no air in it. Marin would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning with her jaw clenched so tight her molars ached, and she would lie in the dark and deliberately relax each muscle group from her feet, upward the way a therapist had taught her when she was 19, and eventually the jaw would release, and she would not fall back asleep. So, cabinets, plausible, not worth investigating. The next thing was the thermostat. She kept the house at 68. She had kept it at 68 for the 4 years she had owned the house. A small 3-bedroom Craftsman she had bought because the bones were good, and because she understood, better than most buyers, exactly what the inspection report meant. She came home from work on a Friday and the house was 84 degrees. The thermostat had been set to 84. Not broken, not malfunctioning set. The display showed it clearly. Someone had pressed the buttons and moved the target temperature 16 degrees, and the system had obediently complied, and the house was sweltering in a way that hit her when she opened the front door like a wall of used air. 84 degrees was the temperature her mother kept the house in Ashland. Marin knew this because she had fought about it every single visit for 15 years. Her mother ran cold. Her mother kept the house at 84 and wore a sweater on top of that, and the air in that house was always thick and still and too warm, and Marin would sit in it during visits feeling her skin prickle and her patience erode, and her mother would say she was being dramatic, and Marin would say nothing because saying nothing was the only tool that worked. She stood in her own hallway in the heat, and a feeling went through her that she could not name and did not try to. She walked to the thermostat and set it back to 68 and opened every window in the house, and stood on the back porch in the January cold until her fingers went numb. That night she checked the locks twice. She was not sure what she was checking for. The locks were fine. The locks had always been fine. The following week she began to hear something. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound, playing from a room she had just left. She would be in the kitchen and have the distinct impression that someone had been speaking in the living room, and she would walk in and find it silent. But a specific kind of silent, the silence that exists in the immediate wake of a voice before the air has finished carrying it. She knew this was not rational. She knew that air does not carry the residue of speech. She knew that silence is not a substance and does not come in varieties. She knew all of this, and she also knew what she was perceiving, and the two pieces of knowledge existed in her at the same time without reconciling. She started staying late at work, not dramatically, an extra hour sometimes too. She told herself it was the backlog from her 6 weeks away, and this was partly true. There were projects that needed her review, but the truth she was not examining was that she did not want to open her own front door. The house felt like it was waiting for her, not haunted. She would not have used that word and would have been irritated by anyone who suggested it. The house felt attended, as if something was paying attention to the rooms even when she was not in them. She called her friend Dana on a Tuesday. They had known each other since college. Dana was a family therapist, which Maren found both convenient and slightly exhausting, because Dana had a tendency to hear the thing beneath the thing you were saying and reflect it back to you before you were ready. "I think the house is bothering me," Maren said. "Bothering you how?" Dana said. Maren described the cabinets and the thermostat. She did not describe the silence after voices because she could not find a way to say it that did not sound unwell. Dana was quiet for a moment. "Have you thought about talking to someone?" Dana said professionally. "About your mom?" "I am fine," Maren said. "I know you are fine," Dana said, in the specific voice that meant she was choosing not to push. "But grief does things to a house. Not to the house, to how you experience the house. You lived in her space for 6 weeks. You slept in your childhood bed. That is not nothing, Mare. I know it is not nothing. I am managing it." "You always manage it," Dana said, and there was something in her voice that was careful and sad and that Maren chose not to hear. She managed it. She went to work. She came home. She set the thermostat to 68 and it stayed at 68. The cabinets stayed closed. For a week, almost 2, the house behaved like a house, and Maren began to believe she had been right, that it was grief performing tricks on an exhausted mind, that the architecture of her distress had simply expressed itself in the architecture she lived in, and now it was passing. Then she found the note. It was on the kitchen counter on the small pad of paper she kept near the phone, her own handwriting. She recognized it instantly, the particular way she crossed her sevens, the slight leftward lean. The note said, "Don't forget to call. She worries." Maren had not written this note. She was certain of it the way she was certain of load calculations, not as belief but as structural fact. She had not written it, but it was her handwriting. And the words were words her mother had said to her many times about calling, about the phone being a tool Maren used as a weapon of silence, about the specific cruelty of a daughter who could go 2 weeks without calling and not even notice the gap. "Don't forget to call. She worries." Her mother's sentence in Maren's hand. She picked up the note and looked at it for a long time. She held it up to the light as if the light would reveal something. Then she opened the cabinet under the sink and put it in the trash and pressed the lid down and washed her hands and stood at the sink with the water running over her knuckles and understood, in a way she could not yet articulate, that something had come home with her from Ashland, not a ghost. Maren did not believe in ghosts, and this experience was not converting her. What she understood, standing at the sink, was both simpler and worse than a ghost. She understood that 6 weeks in her mother's house had done something to her that she had not consented to and could not see the edges of, that she had absorbed something, that her mother's patterns, her mother's temperatures, her mother's insistence on being heard in every room at every moment, had gotten into Maren the way moisture gets into a foundation, not through a single crack, but through the million invisible pores of proximity and time. And now those patterns were expressing themselves, in her home, through her hands. In handwriting that was hers performing sentences that were not. This should have been a relief, a rational explanation, grief processing, somatic memory, automatic behavior during dissociative states caused by exhaustion and loss. She could explain every event. The cabinets, she had opened them in a fugue state. recreating the constant opening and searching her mother did in her kitchen, the restless hands, always moving energy that filled that house. The thermostat, muscle memory from 6 weeks of living at 84 degrees. The note, her own hand, writing her mother's words, while some part of her mind she did not have access to, completed a conversation that would now never be completed, rational, explicable, and it did not help at all, because the rational explanation was, in its own way, more disturbing than a haunting, a ghost you could hire someone to deal with. A ghost was external, removable, a problem with a boundary. What Marin was describing to herself was a problem without a boundary. If her own hands were doing things she could not remember, if her mother's patterns had overwritten some part of her operating code, then the contamination was not in the house, it was in the person, and she could not leave herself. She began to watch her own hands. At work, she caught herself reaching for things before she needed them, a preemptive restlessness that was not hers. At home, she found herself standing in rooms she had not intended to enter, as if she had been pulled there by a current she could not feel. She started keeping a journal, not of her thoughts, but of her movements. 8:15, walked to kitchen. 8:17, opened refrigerator, closed it without taking anything out. 8:20, walked to living room. 8:20, 3, adjusted thermostat from 68 to 70. She caught that one. She had not decided to adjust the thermostat. Her hand had done it. She set it back. She stared at her hand. Dana called her on a Thursday. Marin almost didn't answer, which was itself a data point, because Marin always answered Dana's calls. She had a flash of irritation at the sound of the phone, a hot, bright feeling that the phone was an intrusion, that people should know better than to call when she was trying to have a quiet evening, and the feeling was so foreign and so specific, and so precisely her mother's, that she answered the phone immediately just to prove the feeling wrong. "How are you doing?" Donna said. "I am writing things I don't remember writing," Marin said. She had not planned to say this. It came out the way a supporting wall reveals itself when you remove the plaster. It had been there the whole time, holding something up. Dana was quiet for long enough that Marin almost spoke again. "What kinds of things?" Dana said. "Things she used to say." In my handwriting, the line was quiet again. "Mare," Dana said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually hear me ask it instead of managing it." "Okay," Marin said. "Do you think you might be becoming her?" The question landed in the middle of Marin's chest and sat there with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. She did not answer. She listened to Dana breathing on the other end, and she looked at her own hands resting on the kitchen table, and she thought about the 6 weeks in Ashland, the way she had slept in her mother's house, and eaten from her mother's plates, and washed her body in her mother's shower, and breathed her mother's air. The thick, warm 84-degree air that smelled like lavender and soup, and something underneath those things that was just her mother, the specific chemical signature of a person, and how that signature had surrounded her for 42 days and nights while she was open and raw and hollowed out by the work of watching someone die. "I have to go," Marin said. "Please talk to someone," Dana said. "Not me, someone professional." "I will," Marin said, and she hung up and sat at the table and did not move for a very long time. She did not talk to someone professional. Instead, she began an experiment. She was an engineer. She understood controlled variables. She bought a small camera, the kind used for home security, and she set it up in the kitchen, aimed at the counter and the thermostat and the cabinets. If she was doing things in a dissociative state, the camera would show her. She would see herself performing her mother's routines, and the seeing would break the pattern. Consciousness was the intervention. You could not unknowingly do a thing you were watching yourself do. She checked the footage every evening. For 4 days, the footage showed nothing. An empty kitchen, light moving across the floor as the sun tracked. The cat. She had a cat, a gray tabby named Bolt, walking through occasionally, jumping on the counter, leaving. No Marin, no open cabinets. No thermostat adjustments. The house behaving as a house should behave when no one is in it. On the 5th day, she came home and the kitchen smelled like soup. Not the memory of soup, not a hint or a suggestion. The full, rich, heavy smell of the potato soup her mother made every Sunday for as long as Marin could remember. The recipe that Marin knew by heart and had never once made because the smell of it was so thoroughly her mother's that to make it would have felt like trespass. The kitchen smelled like that soup, and on the stove was a pot, and in the pot was the soup, still warm. Marin stood in the kitchen, and the smell was so dense and so complete that she was 9 years old for a moment. She was standing in her mother's kitchen in Ashland, and her mother was at the stove, and the windows were fogged from the heat, and the radio was playing something she couldn't identify, and her mother was talking, not to Marin, just talking, narrating the soup, narrating the weather, narrating her own thoughts in a continuous unbroken stream that filled the kitchen like the steam. And Marin was 9 years old, and had not yet learned to resent this, had not yet built the rooms inside herself, where she put the things her mother made her feel, and she was just standing in a warm kitchen that smelled like soup and her mother was alive. She came back to herself. She was in Eugene. She was standing in her own kitchen. There was soup on her stove that she had no memory of making. She walked to the camera and pulled the footage. She watched herself enter the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon. She watched herself open cabinets and take out a pot and potatoes and onions and butter and broth. She watched herself chop and measure and stir with a fluency and ease that she recognized as her mother's, not her own competent but deliberate way of cooking, but her mother's intuitive, unhesitating way, hands that never paused because the recipe lived in the body rather than the mind. She watched herself cook for 40 minutes. At no point on the video did her face appear confused or asleep or blank. She looked like a woman making soup on a Sunday afternoon. She looked comfortable. She looked. Marin realized, like her mother. She closed the laptop. She did not watch the footage again. She went to the stove and looked at the soup, and the soup looked back at her with its familiar pale surface, and she picked up the pot and carried it to the sink and poured it out and watched it swirl down the drain, thick and slow. She did not sleep that night. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and conducted an audit of herself with the same systematic attention. She would give a compromised structure. She examined her own patterns, the growing irritation at phone calls, the desire to keep the house warm, the restlessness in the kitchen, the need to have her hands busy, the impulse to fill silence with sound. She cataloged each one, and beside each one she placed its origin, not hers. Her mother's imported, absorbed through the permeable membrane of grief and proximity, and installed in her without her knowledge or consent. The question Dana had asked sat in the center of the audit, like a crack in a bearing wall. Do you think you might be becoming her? And the answer Marin arrived at, lying in the dark at 3 in the morning, with her jaw clenched and her molars aching, was worse than yes. The answer was, I don't know where she stops and I start. The answer was, I went to that house to watch her die, and something about the watching was also an opening, and she came through it not as a spirit or a presence, but as a pattern, a set of instructions, a way of being that was so strong and so total that 6 weeks of exposure was enough to begin overwriting 38 years of Marin. The answer was, I am a building, and something has gotten into my foundation, and I know exactly what moisture in a foundation does. It does not announce itself. It does not make a dramatic entrance. It just slowly, patiently, irreversibly changes the structure of what was already there, until one day the building is not the building it was, and no one can say exactly when the change happened, because it happened everywhere at once, a little at a time. She got up and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen in the dark. The kitchen still smelled faintly of soup. She opened a cabinet deliberately this time with full consciousness, and took out a glass and filled it with water and drank it. Her hand on the cabinet was her hand, her choice. She was sure of this. She was almost sure of this. She looked at the thermostat on her way back to bed. 72 degrees. She had not changed it. She set it back to 68. She went upstairs. In the morning she called Dana and asked for a referral. Dana gave her a name. Marin made an appointment. She went to work. She managed. The appointment was for the following Tuesday, and she held it in her mind like a fixed point, something to organize the days around, and the days needed organizing because they had begun to blur at the edges in a way that frightened her. On Monday night, she was sitting on the couch reading when she heard herself say, out loud to the empty room, "Well, are you going to just sit there?" Her own voice, her mother's words. The exact intonation, the specific rhythm of impatience and invitation that her mother used when she wanted Marin to get up and help in the kitchen, to come be near her, to stop retreating into a book and be present in the shared space of the house. Marin heard herself say it, and the words were already in the air before she understood that her mouth had produced them, and the sound of her own voice saying her mother's sentence in her mother's cadence, in her own living room, was the thing that finally broke something open in her. She did not cry. Marin was not someone who cried easily, and she recognized this about herself as another wall she had built, and she understood that the walls were the problem, that the walls were what made her permeable paradoxically, because a person who will not process grief through the normal channels forces it to find other routes. And the routes it had found were her hands and her voice and her thermostat and her kitchen, and the grief was not haunting her house. The grief was using her, finding expression through the only doors she had left unlocked, which were the ones she didn't know about. She sat on the couch and said nothing else for a long time. The house was quiet around her, truly quiet. Not the loaded silence of a voice just finished, but the genuine quiet of an empty room in an empty house in a neighborhood in Eugene, Oregon, on a Monday night in February. She listened to it. She tried to hear it as just quiet. She could not tell if she succeeded. She went to the appointment on Tuesday. She sat in a chair across from a woman named Dr. Kessler and described, in the systematic and precise language of someone accustomed to assessment reports, what had been happening. Dr. Kessler listened without interrupting. When Marin was done, Dr. Kessler asked her a question that Marin was not expecting. "What did you not say to your mother before she died?" Marin opened her mouth, and nothing came out. She sat there with her mouth open and her hands in her lap, and the answer was so large and so old and so thoroughly loaded, bearing that removing it felt like it would bring the entire structure down. She closed her mouth. She looked at her hands. "Everything," she said. "I didn't say everything." And Dr. Kessler nodded, and the nod was not performative. It was the nod of someone who understood exactly which wall had just been identified and how much weight it was carrying. Marin went home that evening and walked into her house and stood in the hallway. The house was 68 degrees. The cabinets were closed. The kitchen did not smell like anything. She stood there and waited for the feeling of being watched, the sense of attendance, the impression of a voice just finished speaking. It was there, faint but there, not gone. She did not think it would be gone for a long time, if ever. She thought about what Dr. Kessler had said and what Dana had asked, and she thought about the soup and the note and the thermostat and her mother's voice coming out of her mouth, and she understood that the project ahead of her was not an exorcism, but a negotiation. That her mother was in her now, not as a ghost, but as a grammar, a syntax of behavior that had been written into Marin during the most open and undefended weeks of her life, and that this grammar would express itself until she learned to hear it as separate from her own, not to remove it. She was not sure it could be removed, but to hear it, to recognize the sentence as borrowed, to feel the hand reach for the thermostat and know whose impulse was moving it. She walked into the kitchen. She looked at the stove. She thought about the soup. She thought about her mother standing at that stove in Ashland for 30 years talking to a room, filling a house with sound and warmth and the smell of something cooking. And she thought about how she had spent her whole adult life building herself into the opposite of that, quiet and cool and contained, and how the opposite of a thing is still defined by the thing. And how she had never been free of that kitchen, not once, not for a single day of her composed and well-managed life. She stood in her own kitchen, and the house was quiet, and the air was cool, and the cabinets were closed, and everything was exactly as she had said it, and she could not tell whether the woman standing there was Marin, or the version of her mother that had taken root in Marin, or some third thing that was both and neither. Some new architecture that had not yet been assessed for structural integrity. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. She brushed her teeth and looked at her face in the mirror, and her face looked like her face, though she noticed, as if for the first time, how much she had her mother's jaw. She lay down. She set her alarm. She closed her eyes, and in the dark behind her eyes the kitchen in Ashland was still there, warm and fogged and smelling of soup, and her mother was still at the stove, and she was still talking, and Marin could almost hear what she was saying, and the almost was the part that would keep her awake, not tonight but many nights. The almost hearing, the nearly recognizing, the understanding that the voice was not coming from the house, or from the air, or from any direction she could point to, but from somewhere inside the structure of herself that she had not known existed, and could not now find the walls of.